All right, we should all be back, and we are getting into our wrap up or our summary reports. It'll be very quick because we haven't had a chance to really think through what we have, and so I'll break out group one. Who was leading that? Was that you, Carl?
That was me. Yeah, there were about 8 of us in there, and the breakout group one was kind of about, well, it says right here, leveraging current science information database mapping tools to generate resource-driven data products. So we ended up talking a lot about, what database how to create a database, and what it needs to contain. And I'd say the main theme that we got from this, because we got 20 minutes, right? We don't have much time for me to talk about this, is that in the end, what is needed is probably to prepare a reserve report. Okay. Now that it's like art. I think we all immediately said, oh, I know what that is. But what is it exactly? That still needs to be defined. Who makes it, how it's made, reviews, evaluations, criterion for goodness of whatever, reliability, things like that, is ultimately what needs to come out of the models and the databases that are developed. And so this reserve report basically turns the plethora of data that we currently have into something the board of directors can understand, right? I mean, that's the key, okay? Because currently what we have now is a whole lot of raw data and some advanced data. It's in the PDS, right? But that is insufficient to basically do what needs to be done, and that's where you have these models and the databases that combine all the various data together into one or into maybe some kind of data products. And those advanced data products can be used to develop maybe the reserve maps, right? And with that information, then you can potentially go on and entice mining companies to then get involved and financial institutions get involved. So this is all very commercial focused, I think, perspective that we were taking on it. So that is it in a 3-minute nutshell, Clive. And anybody else in the group want to speak up? There's a lot of discussions, and I just gave a quick overview. So we probably have, 3-4 more minutes for us to talk, Clive?
Go ahead, mate. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Any more comments, guys?
Yeah, 30 seconds for me. If there is a reserve report, I'd be happy to put it on the platform that my colleagues and I are building, because you need a platform in order to promote it. So, and I know that these things always require tweaking along the way. So that's part of life. Yeah. So you have a home for a reserve report.
So my internet is vaguely cooperating with me. We'll see if I'm booted off yet again. Either way, the other point that came up regarding building towards a reserve report was we should potentially look at ways to collaborate in doing one perhaps for the moon, as a group, rather than traditionally in traditional mining, a reserve report would be prepared by one company to go to investors. But I think given the difficulty of the project, I think it would be worth looking at trying to do one in cooperation with academia and perhaps different companies working together, I think is a key point that I would love to explore more and talk to people about.
That was intrinsic. I had no idea that was an assumption on my part. That would be a single report by all of us. That brings up the point: how do you do international collaborations? Because this would be international, yet funding does not cross borders too well, and that was brought up. We could do PDART, but then that's only for NASA or American U.S. citizens.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
You make a portfolio of reserve reports to address that. So one part of that portfolio could be from the US citizens, another one could be international. I mean, the moon's got a lot of locations, so.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And along the lines of the open data that we're hoping to encourage the community to embrace as much as possible, these reserve reports could be made from lots of people looking at the same data, if the data is there, and then you document well your assumptions and misassumptions of what you put into your model. which has to be really clearly articulated at different stages because that's going to change with time. So there's one thing about raw data and calibrated data, but then you have your derived products and then what went on to make that derived products. We have to make sure that's also very articulated somehow in this database, pre-reserve reports, architecture. And how it's peer reviewed or evaluated by a body or self-regulated or not sure how.
Thank you.
Also, one point from the chat that was actually pre our group, but I think is actually really germane to that point, was also the idea of how do we get funding for a campaign versus missions. And I think that that's something that we definitely need to discuss. Is that what my thought over there was? What happens if funding gets cut or partially funded? I think that we need to be careful that if we approach things in the perspective of a campaign, that we're still viable on smaller scales, which is going to, of course, make it a lot more difficult. But I think you scare away a lot of applications potentially if you say you need to fund this for 30 years and otherwise you're not going to get any benefits. You need to make sure the pitch kind of is like, oh, it all ties together, but if we get items 1, 7, and 12, we can still make it work or something like that.
Well, my way of looking at this is when you get a campaign, it is a campaign of missions. And what we need is a logical sequence that will lead us to the end goal. That way, if funding gets cut, we're going to make slower progress, that's for sure. Or if there is promise, I can see that the momentum will gather, and we make progress with Viper. It's going to uncover maybe more impetus to get other future missions funded. But the thing is that we got to start somewhere in terms of logically putting resources and resource evaluation in some sort of roadmap that makes sense, so that we can achieve the lofty goals that have been articulated. But I'm going to move on to the next breakout group, which is breakout 2, which measurements needed for ICU resource identification and implementation, including measurement types and characteristics. So we talked a little bit at the beginning there about orbital versus surface ground truth data, and extrapolating between some orbital data sets, especially those subsurface data sets with the neutrons, and what you would get in terms of resolution from a surface asset may require some neutron data, low altitude neutron data, but we come up against a resolution limit from orbit. But if that was to be done, then probably should be done early on. I think the main conclusion that came out of our group was that we need a combination of methods, and that is something that radar, maybe shallow seismics, and innovative ways that Viper's thinking about using the percussive drill to look at the immediate subsurface and sense the immediate subsurface. There's also mobile neutron spectrometers that could be used as well, but there are ways that could be tested on this planet in certain regions. Electrical properties was another thing that came up that is going to be needed. So it's not just one particular measurement, but it's a multitude, and the integration of those data sets will give us access to the subsurface. The idea of resolution of data, we talked about for surface ice, and Shuai Li has obviously thought about this in great detail. So thanks for that, Shuai. But the resolution goes hand in hand with the technique. So radar is good looking at layers several centimeters thick, maybe not so good at looking at pore space filled ice in the subsurface. So combinations of methods that would allow us to look at the form of the deposits is something that would also be useful. The talk about impact gardening and how old is the ice now. As Tony spoke to, and he can do it better than me, but Viper, we need to understand the origin of the ice, because then that will allow us to make better predictive maps on the basis of the data we have, and help inform us where we're going. If it's young ice, if it's old ice. In terms of a resource, we really don't care, but we need to be able to know the right places to look for it. So that is something else that that needs to be considered. And then finally, we need to be able to use clips as technique development campaigns. But the issue with clips that I thought about just as the session ended is it's not going in. They're not going into a PSR, at least right now. And that's where we need to get in order to actually ground through some of these techniques, as well as the material that's present there. Anybody from the group want to add anything? Well, I'm sure I've missed a lot, but any comments from the group there? We had quite a few people in there, so please speak up. So either that was a bloody good summary, or all people from my group have run away.
No, this is Tony Clive. I'll emphasize one point that I think is something the entire group should consider, and it may be, I may be saying something unpopular, but I do think we need to be careful. We don't do too much, if you will, research into ice. What you said about origins is important, I think, for the early missions, but then you quickly focus on what the resource is. And I don't know, I saw Jerry Sanders on earlier, but I fear that if we try to understand what the deep ice is, that we're going to take too long and not feed the necessary information for the current architecture considerations for NASA, at least in terms of using 1 to 2 meter ice. And I think they're two very different problems. We have methods and more data for the top meter. We have nothing for below that right now, and is a consideration that actually there's two different pathways. One is first do what we absolutely necessarily need to do for the in terms of measurements for the top meter or two, and then later consider deeper ice as a more broader long-term research goal. And I think John put out like 5 meters as a horizon, and I'm totally open to negotiating where that horizon is. But I think if we have everything out there on the table, it lacks focus.
Yep.
Hey Tony, I missed a lot of today's discussion so far because of other issues, but I completely agree with what you just said. In the ISRU Envision Futures Priority Strategy that we released, there is a subnote that says the desire for measurements, below at least 3 meters. So pick your number of choice, but I've heard enough from the science community in general, from the interpretations of LCROSS, that we have good measurements that get us down to 1 meter, the neutron spectrometer, drilling, that we definitely pursue as quickly as possible. But if the science in the resource community believes we need to go deeper, the sooner we make that statement to SMD and STMD, the better for investment purposes.
All right, thanks, guys. We're going to move on to Angel.
Thank you, Clive. So, breakout session 3, that was about the how we're going to go about collecting this data, the methods, the tools, and the mission approaches to accomplish resource evaluation objectives. And nicely tying to what Clive's session ended up discussing, there was some early talk about how science is important to give us some information about geological context so that we don't have to have 1,000 missions to go everywhere. So that's important. Viper will provide some of that early thing. It will also provide a way to test the challenges of operating on these unique places for communications, for power. But it was also, the comment was that after that, we need to go down to where the research are and really characterize that. And that ties very nicely with what Tony was saying, what Jerry and what you were saying, Clive, that we need to go down and start going deeper so that we can provide that information that is needed for economic reasons. And so that was agreed. I mean, that was a comment from our group. There was some comments about, and this ties to breakout session 1 when they were talking about a reserve report. Do we need a new way to characterize resources and reserves other than the ones that are used on the mining industry, like the JOR code or the oil and gas industry? There was some talk about some consensus that we do not need a new code, that we can take one of the ones that we have right now, either in the mining or oil and gas industry, and adapt it to what's needed on the moon. Because yes, there's some subtle differences. There's different clients for the moon. We have space agencies that for them research may be different from what a commercial company is. So just an adaptation of what we have now would be the way to go instead of recreating or spending time on doing a new code. So that was some of the discussion. Interestingly, one comment was that companies, as well as space agencies, obviously need a planetary geologist, a planetary scientist on board. So for all of you that are looking for jobs, that's a good indication that these companies need somebody that can assess the data, look for patterns, and know how to interpret it and be able to more quickly arrive to the definition of what a reserve is. And finally, the comments started going towards the direction of what would be our next workshop that will be in October, how to implement things. And so the conversation started going, who should get involved in this? Is how our company is going to be enticed to help on this? How international this is going to get? And so once we started going in that direction, that tells us that that's the next stop for what we need to talk in our next workshop. Anybody from our group that wants to add something?
Yeah, I'll add something. I think it's important as we move closer to economic development that we include more stakeholders in this conversation. So whether we create a booth and we go to mining conferences and oil and gas conferences and let them know, or at the big planetary science conferences, talk to them and get them comp a booth or whatever it is, but start doing a bit of an exchange where we start putting people in these different areas so that we learn the language, understand what's going on, so that we do get there. There's kind of like what Open Lunar was saying earlier. There's a lot of personal hurdles. There's a lot of interpersonal things and policy things we need to get over that we can be doing now while the technology matures, rather than doing the technology then doing the interpersonal.
Anybody else?
You could try and get sponsorship, corporate sponsorship for some of the things that these communities doing. I don't know if that's been tried yet, but having some of the big miners and energy companies on board and infrastructure players as well, that could be one way where they financially support the activities. Example, to make a resources report, whether it's terrestrial or lunar specific. That could be one way of getting some commercial activity happen. The next step would be following the mining industry, where it's a lot of location leases turn into royalties for companies, but that might be a bit too early in the game for what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go, Clive. I think that sets up nicely for the next workshop on how is that we implement.
Man, it's almost as if we planned it.
Yes.
But
Everybody wants to know how we're going to do this. And
yeah,
according
well,
to
I want to know how we're going to do this. So yeah, that's going to be a lively discussion, and it could be something that we start at the next workshop, but continue through Lssw and other forums. Luxembourg Space Week is another one to think about, and potentially others. I think that this is certainly bigger than the United States, and it's going to require a planet to sort of pull this together, because it is a campaign, and that implementation thereof is going to be critical.